welcome to Gen Z on Leadership. I'm Gabriel Gary, the host, and today I have on the show Mr. Luke Schumacher. Luke is a West Point graduate who served as a military intelligence officer for over 7 years. With the U.S. Army, he served all over the world, including spending time in Afghanistan, South Korea, and Palau, just to list a few. He received his master's in philosophy from the University of Cambridge in political thought and intellectual history, and he holds a JD from Stanford Law School. Luke is currently a PhD candidate in political science and government at the University of Virginia. Thank you so much, Luke, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Gabe. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, so something I was very interested in is that you're also a Culver graduate, and I'm a student here at Culver Academy. So you've been through, is it 8 years now of military school with Culver and then West Point? And I'm just wondering, like, first of all, I mean, how did you choose to come to Culver? Because it's a very, I guess, unorthodox high school experience than the typical American high school student has. And how did those military schools shape your development as a leader in the military and now as a civilian side?
Yeah, awesome. Very small correction. I spent 7 years between the two schools because I came to Culver only after doing my freshman year at a Catholic high school in Indianapolis. But
Gotcha.
it was one of the better decisions I ever made to transfer to Culver. I don't know why it took me so long, why I didn't start freshman year, but I can tell you I ended up there because I was really enticed by the opportunity to have a little distance from my parents, many of the friends with whom I grew up, and just kind of chart my own course. And it seemed like a really exciting opportunity to do that. And I thought Culver was going to be the right kind of environment to challenge me academically, physically, spiritually. And it delivered on all those fronts. So you're correct that I ended up going, I suppose, to two military schools, Culver followed by West Point. And in some ways, looking back at it now at 34 years old, it just felt like one big combined experience because Culver, at least at its origins and in some ways still, is self-consciously modeled on West Point, down to those wool pants that you're probably wearing. I think it's the same manufacturer, right? But honestly, while I was at Culver, going to West Point wasn't something I had anticipated. If you asked any of my teachers or coaches at Culver, and certainly like the TAC officers and military leaders,
Mhm.
I think they'd all say they were quite surprised that I ended up at West Point. And that's because at Culver, I never really embraced the military structure. I think I graduated with private rank, which I
Really?
probably laughed about at the time.
Mhm.
Yeah, but looking back, I suspect that was a missed opportunity because Culver's military structure creates these really unique opportunities for teenagers to exercise peer leadership. And it strikes me that that's like probably the most challenging form of leadership, as a 15-year-old trying to
Definitely.
convince your friends, your classmates that they need to shine their shoes, sweep their floors, show up on time for breakfast formation. It's a really unique leadership laboratory. Um, but once at West Point, knowing that I was going to join the profession of arms, that I would be an Army officer, I think I embraced those leadership opportunities more fully. But what I think I can tell you, what I kind of drew starting at Culver is I was cultivating, developing these habits that I think would serve me and the teams that I would lead pretty well. At Culver, I think I first became something of an expert in time management, and that wasn't deliberate. I'm sure you're realizing this too if you haven't already. It's just like a survival mechanism, right? When you've got this really intense academic course load. I was playing three sports. I was leading organizations like Model UN, student government. I just discovered over trial and error that I couldn't fulfill like 70% of my obligations if I didn't have the day mapped out in 15-minute increments. So still today, I maintain a really detailed calendar and impose deadlines on myself because otherwise it's not all going to get done. And the second thing I think I learned at Culver that I didn't know how important it was at the time was just learning how to be comfortable in discomfort. I don't know what the barracks are like there today, but in my time, even during like the study hours, it was pretty rowdy, sometimes
Mhm.
raucous. So I'd throw on those really uncomfortable wool pants. I'd go to that beautiful Huffington library, pull up into the stiffest chair right next to the water, and there I do my work until someone kicked me out. And still today, I don't read on a sofa or a bed. I've got to be like in a stiff chair on at a desk, and I think that was good training for the Army, where there's any number of austere environments where you've got to like draw on a map, work out a plan, brief it to others, in dark, in rain, in cold. So learning to be comfortable and how to operate in discomfort is really important.
Hmm. And next, I just want to talk about after West Point, then you decided to go into military intelligence. And why did you choose MI specifically, and how did that come about?
Yeah, yeah. I think, military intelligence was the best alignment of my skills, or as I understood my skill set, against the needs of the Army. So every U.S. military officer, whatever their commissioning source, is going to engage in something like a negotiation with, in my case, Big Army. The Army has its requirements. We need X number of infantry officers, artillery officers, cyber officers, right? And each individual officer in training has their preferences, right? And if those two don't align, then the individual's preference is going to yield to the needs of the Army, and rightfully so. But I was fortunate to be commissioned as a military intelligence officer. It's exactly what I wanted. But I would have been happy to do any number of things. But I think I was drawn to intelligence for the same reasons I'm drawn to social science theory and like political science. What I try to do today, and that's because I really like using data, things we know about the past and the present, to try to predict the future. And that's fundamentally the job of a military intelligence officer. You're trying to use history, doctrine, information you've collected, all in service of reducing uncertainty on the battlefield, all so that you can try to predict what the enemy is most likely to do or what its range of options are. So you can tell your commander, advise the commander, so that he or she is more capable of accomplishing the mission. So at the end of the day, I think I was just drawn to like the creative and research intensive process that can be intelligence, and that's why I ended up selecting that.
Got it. Thank you. And with intelligence, I mean, some people have I don't think they have the most clear picture of what intelligence is. But when I was doing research on you and I was listening to some of your podcasts, you talked about constitutional statesmanship and how those two terms can kind of be at ends with each other or almost contradictory in a sense. And I'm wondering like the internal I guess conflict that you have in the military because when someone gives you an order that you have to follow, let's say you don't necessarily agree with that. And from my perspective, I could see that this could happen in intelligence, just because there's a lot of high stakes scenarios. Did you ever handle or encounter a scenario where you got an order that you weren't like morally aligned with, and how did you handle that if you did?
Oh yeah, sure. Well, I suppose we should start with the baseline rule, which is that soldiers have a duty to follow all legal orders and to refuse all illegal orders, right? And that sounds straightforward enough. It sounds intuitive,
Mm,
but it's actually not all that helpful when you need a rule like that, because that rule is going to come to the fore at the margins where you're uncertain about whether the order is legal or illegal. And most soldiers aren't burdened by a legal education, right? So it's really hard for them to distinguish
yeah.
between legal and illegal orders sometimes, even when one does have a legal education and a lot of practice in the law. It's not always abundantly clear what the legal limits of military operations are, right? So let's just give you briefly one example. Just a couple weeks ago, our Supreme Court, 9 justices there that know the law pretty damn well, they couldn't all agree on whether Trump's orders for National Guard troops to go to Chicago are legal, right? And I imagine they'd be similarly divided over the legality of other military operations, like Trump's strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, kinetic strikes on drug smuggling boats in the Caribbean, on the raid to capture Maduro in Venezuela, right? So if our top expositors of federal law can't quite agree on the legal limits of military operations, I think it's asking entirely too much to demand that most soldiers, again, who don't have a legal education,
Yeah.
to distinguish and locate the legal limits of military operations, right? So I think for that reason, most soldiers are entitled to rely on the presumption that the orders they're getting from commanders are legal. And where they have a serious doubt, they're entitled to rely on the legal opinion of the first like military lawyer in their chain of command.
Okay.
Um, so fortunately for me, but I think unsurprisingly, given our military, I was never ordered to do anything that I thought was blatantly illegal or a violation of the Army ethic.
Mm.
Had I think the only recourse you have is to resign and publicize your reasons. But there were times where I wasn't quite convinced what we were doing was the most prudent thing, right? So in Afghanistan, I was a targeting officer, so I was trying to positively identify members of violent extremist organizations that we could either target with drone strikes or capture in raids, right? And I often in that environment felt like this referee in this tug of war. On the one side, you had infantry infantrymen and officers who were trained to push for kinetic action, right? On the other side, you had these military lawyers in our unit who were kind of trained to pull back that action until it was fully vetted. And so wherever I had serious doubts about whether this person, who this person was we were tracking, who they were with, what bad things they had done, I would side with the military lawyer, the judge advocate in this tug
Yeah.
of war. And I think that like matters. That sends a signal to your commander when they see the intelligence officer and they see the military lawyer on the same side of this tug of war. It gives them pause. And then they think, maybe military action at this time is unwarranted or at least premature. So that's how I'd kind of resolve that tension.
Got it. Thank you. Next, you specialize in negotiation work, especially in South Korea, I read. But doing that work in 6 countries during your army deployments, what do you think is the most important element of communication? And I mean, especially communicating with people that don't want to reciprocate any like important information. What do you think is the most important element, and how can we, I guess, use that in our everyday life if someone's the normal person's not going to be in intelligence, but how they can use that to their advantage?
Oh yeah, I think you hit the hammer on the head right there. Sometimes you're involved in communicative exercises where the other party is um, not empowered or willing to reciprocate, right? As you put it, and
Mm.
that was kind of exactly my experience in South Korea. So I spent my first couple of years of active duty stationed in South Korea, and the latter year I was a member of a multinational military unit called the United Nations Command Military Armistice Commission. Very long, very long title, UNCMAC for short, but it's a holdover from the Korean War because the Korean War doesn't end with a peace agreement in 1953, but instead ends with this armistice agreement that still survives some 70 years later, right? So my organization was responsible for supervising the armistice between North and South Korea, right? And that means ensuring that only authorized kinds of weapon systems are in the demilitarized zone, that whenever skirmishes happen, there's cross border firing, that we conduct an investigation and try to determine who was at fault, how to prevent this in the future, that when there's illicit fishing activities on the southern side of the Han River estuary, that we repel those fishermen. All sorts of violations of the armistice agreement can occur, right? So when I was there between 2016 and 2018, unfortunately, the North Korean People's Army and North Korea more broadly was uh, was um, was just not really receptive to our mission. They weren't invested in managing the armistice agreement in the way that they had agreed to in 1953. Um, Communication between North Korea, South Korea, and the U.S. was at probably its lowest ebb, such that they weren't answering our phone calls, they weren't responding to our written correspondence, they weren't receiving our letters. So we resorted whenever we'd find like the remains of a North Korean soldier in South Korea that we wanted to repatriate, whenever we had the results of an investigation prepared for their review, we would basically have to show up at Conference Row in the demilitarized zone. There's 3 blue buildings, and use a bullhorn to shout our message at the North Korean People's
Wow.
Army, and that's how they'd receive it. Then one day out of the blue, we had the results of this investigation we conducted about an alleged armistice violation, and they responded positively to our invitation to discuss this matter at Conference Row. So after 10 years of poor communication, we came prepared with our list of items that we wanted to discuss, with our number of proposals to increase cooperation and better uphold the armistice agreement. And it just didn't matter, right? Because once we got in the room, it became clear in short order that the North Korean People's Army, their representatives there, were not empowered by the political leadership, Kim Jong Un down, to make any concessions, to talk
Mm,
frankly about the nature of the armistice. They instead, it was we were props. A bunch of North Koreans taking pictures of us so that they could, they could message to their domestic audience that the imperialists were rebuffed by the powerful North Korean army. So, you
mm,
know, no matter how much preparation you put in, no matter your best intentions and the professionalism with which you conduct yourself, sometimes good communication and positive results will not obtain for reasons entirely beyond your control. But preparation is key, because you never know when that window of opportunity is going to open up. So your demeanor, your professionalism, your preparation all matter. You just sometimes there's things well beyond your control.
gotcha. Thank you so much for that. Next, I want to talk about your, I guess, like academia side of your career and your intellectual history background. And I was just wondering, what are some examples of history you look up to and why? And then also, if you, this is just an add-on, but if you have anyone that is a leader that's looked fondly upon in history, but you don't necessarily think they were as good as they were, or someone who you think that people shouldn't look up to, that they maybe do in history. And yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'll start with the positive case, I
Mm,
suppose. For me, it's a conventional answer, but I think it's always a defensible one. Abraham Lincoln, right? I
mhm,
think he's the right man for the right time. He's a man who exercised awesome powers, extra constitutional, arguably unconstitutional powers, right? Especially in the spring of 1861, when he takes a series of unilateral actions without congressional notification or acquiescence. But far more importantly than just taking those actions, he's a responsible custodian of that prerogative power, of those awesome powers, right? Because he's using them to the best ends, to the preservation of the Union, to the destruction of an insurrection, and ultimately to the cause of eradicating chattel slavery in the United States, right? He's using these awesome powers for the best reasons. And something I think is so uncommon today is how much he saturated politics and thought, right? He's thinking deeply about our constitutional order, bringing the Declaration of Independence back to the center. He's thinking deeply about not only what he can do, the possibilities of executive power, but what are the limits of it, and how can I bend the Constitution during the Civil War without breaking it, to make sure that it's operable and restored after this emergency, right? Um, and most importantly, since we're having this conversation and you're sitting in Culver, he's kind of one of us. He's a Hoosier, right? He spends his formative years, his Culver aged years
mhm,
in Indiana, and that's, I think, no accident. And another good positive case, I'd say, just so we don't think statesmanship is all behind us, and we haven't, and we don't live in a moment with good political leadership. I
right.
think we should draw a lot of inspiration from the example of Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine today, right? Um, his country is brutally invaded or reinvaded in February 2022 by Russia. The Biden administration is practically begging him to get on a plane, to get to a safe space and enjoy the rest of his life in retirement and exile. And Zelensky, unlike a number of autocrats, refuses. He says, here I stand, I can do no other.
Mhm,
He puts on a uniform and he says, take the jet back, bring me ammo, right? And since that moment, I think he's been proving his opponent, Putin, wrong. Like, right?
Yeah.
Putin says Ukraine is not a real country, never has been. It's always been a part of this Russian empire. And Zelensky from 2022 and all the Ukrainians he's expired have been proving that they are, in fact, a real sovereign country. And they're going to prove it at an enormous cost of blood and treasure.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Second question, a little spicier. Who's revered that maybe shouldn't be? This might be too presentist, but I think there's no shortage of reasons to complain about our recent presidents and certainly the current occupant of the office. But I don't think history is going to look all that kindly on his immediate predecessor, President Joe Biden, either. And I
Mhm.
think that's because he exhibited a kind of vanity and power hunger by seeking a second term once it became obvious to
Yeah.
most voters that he was no longer cognitively capable of carrying on the enormous burdens of the presidency, right? And for him to continue on with that second campaign, when he and his advisors must have known full well that he wasn't fully equipped for that job, I think was a massive blunder and just very self-interested.
Got it. Thank you for that. And another question I wanna ask, and kind of relating to this previous question, is as a political science PhD candidate and also just your study of politics in general, what do you think is the reason that so many politicians today aren't the moral exemplars that we once had or we wish we could have? And if you could boil that down to one reason or a couple reasons, what do you think those are?
Easy questions, Gabe. But um, You know, it, it's not something that I really focus on in my own research, so I don't have any like special expertise or knowledge or insight on this question. But it's a fair question, and one cynical answer is that we get precisely the kind of politicians that we want. We do live, after all, in a representative democracy. We vote for those people that represent us, and they are a reflection of our desires in some ways. But to take your question more seriously, I think you're right. Despite us having free and fair elections, despite us knowing the rules about how primaries work, about how the electoral college, et cetera, works, um, the polls still show that people are deeply dissatisfied with the caliber of our representatives, right? Like, why is that the case if we're voting them in? And I can think of at least one, structural explanation, and that's the current primary system. And the parties are shells of their former selves. The political parties just are enormous or like incredibly weak, right?
Mhm.
So they no longer have any real role in screening candidates that appear on our ballots, and they used to play that screening role. So today, anyone effectively with $25 can register their candidacy and run in a primary. And because the primaries all precede the general elections, the
Mhm.
winners of those primaries are selected by the people who show up to vote in primaries. Those are often your most motivated, your most partisan members of the electorate. So they are selecting people on the furthest polls to the
Yeah.
furthest right in the Republican primaries, to the furthest left in the Democratic primaries. So by time the general election comes, when more voters are involved, you've got your choice between the two most polarizing individuals, right? And that's unlikely to those two people on the ballot are unlikely to be like kind of the moral exemplars
Mhm.
that we've seen in the past. And I don't have any great solutions there other than like more people should vote in primaries, right? And kind of take the wind out of the sails of the most polarizing parts of our electorate.
Got it. And the last question I want to ask is, and I ask all my guests this, but it's what advice would you give to young people seeking careers like similar to your career, military or law, or those just wanting to be effective leaders in their own community?
Yeah, I think I think that advice that could apply across um, certainly has applied in my experience in my career in the military and as a lawyer and in academia, but I think applies pretty broadly outside of it, is that I think almost all professions will reward the ability to closely read, to deeply research, and to clearly write things, right? Um, and uh, I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm kind of allergic to technological developments, but I do understand that AI is going to revolutionize how we do work in a lot of ways. But I just don't think there's any substitute for forming the kind of habits of mind that deep researching and clear writing develop, right? So
Mhm.
in research, the task is to take this complex mess, whether it's a pile of papers in the archives or it's a huge data set, to take that mess and try to impose some kind of order on it, right? To make sense of it.
Right.
And you're organizing reality into something intelligible to other people, a theory, a framework, an explanation that's going to help other people. And then writing, the task is to make that thinking transparent to somebody else, right? Um, I would say, and I feel this daily as a aspiring political scientist trying to come up with theories to explain the world. I think I have a theory and then I try to write it down on paper, and then I realize it's got all these logical inconsistencies, all these holes, all these anomalies. So you really don't know something until you've tried to write it down and write it clearly in a way that someone else understands. And lastly, on that point, it was my Culver government instructor, Joe Horvath, that taught me there's no such thing as good writing, only good rewriting, and that has been true. I found my entire life. And the last piece of advice I give is I'd encourage every young person, but especially the really talented, enterprising, and fortunate folks like those at Culver to start their career in public service. It doesn't have to be your entire career, of course.
Yeah.
My time in the Army was less than 7 years, but there's something formative about serving others, about doing tough things in the service of others, and do it in an institution, right? Whether that's the military, Teach for America, a religious organization, the Peace Corps, whatever it is,
Mm.
chances are that organization is quite a bit older than you, and it knows uh, it knows things. So the institution can teach you, inform you into a better person. So I think doing public service early in your career is going to both develop you and serve others. And I can't imagine a better combination.
Well, thank you so much, Luke Schumacher, for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Hope you had something valuable to take away from this interview with my guest, Luke Schumacher. If you want to learn more about him, I'll link some of his publications and works in the description of this episode. As always, I try to post one episode a month. And if you have a recommendation for a guest, or possibly you want to be a guest on the podcast, feel free to reach out with the contact info below. And as always, thank you so much for listening in.